The wind howled through the desolate ruins of Stalingrad, a once thriving city now reduced to rubble and dust. It was the summer of 1942, and the German Wehrmacht, led by Adolf Hitler, had launched its ambitious offensive to conquer the Soviet Union. Stalingrad, a vital industrial hub and strategic stronghold on the Volga River, became the focal point of Hitler's obsession, and he vowed to crush it. The fate of millions would be decided in this city. Under the blistering sun, columns of German tanks and infantry surged toward Stalingrad, their morale bolstered by previous victories across Europe. The city's defenders, the Red Army under the command of General Vasily Chukov, were fewer in number and woefully under-equipped. Nevertheless, they were determined to make the Germans pay for every inch of Soviet soil. "Comrades, we cannot retreat," Chukov told his soldiers. "There is no land beyond the Volga." The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a clash of armies, but a struggle of wills, a brutal street-by-street fight for control. As the Luftwaffe bombarded the city, turning homes, factories, and buildings into a chaotic maze of ruins, the Soviets dug in. Every corner, every building became a battlefield. German soldiers, confident in their advanced equipment and discipline, quickly discovered that Stalingrad was unlike any battle they had fought before. The Red Army snipers, hidden among the shattered buildings, stalked the invaders with deadly precision. One of the most famous snipers, Vasily Zaitsev, turned the ruined city into his hunting ground, using patience and cunning to eliminate enemy officers. His legend grew as he killed over 200 Germans, becoming a symbol of Soviet resistance. But the Germans were relentless. As their forces pushed deeper into the city, they were met with ferocious resistance. The Soviets, using a strategy called hugging the enemy, stayed close to the German lines, making it nearly impossible for the Luftwaffe to conduct effective airstrikes without hitting their own troops. As the autumn months dragged on, the once quick German advance slowed to a crawl. Soldiers on both sides fought in close quarters, inside wrecked factories, apartments, and sewers. The city's vast industrial complexes, like the Red October steel factory and the tractor plant, became fortresses, with every floor contested by both sides. While the Germans continued their grind toward the Volga, their supply lines grew overstretched, and the harsh Russian winter loomed. Stalingrad, it became clear, would not fall easily. By November 1942, the first snows of winter had blanketed the battleground. The Germans, now entrenched in parts of the city, had underestimated both the Soviet resilience and the severity of the Russian winter. Supplies were running low, and the Wehrmacht soldiers, unprepared for the freezing temperatures, began to feel the toll. While the Germans focused on the city itself, Soviet High Command under General Georgy Zhukov had been planning a surprise. Reinforcements, carefully concealed in the surrounding countryside, were being assembled for a massive counteroffensive. This operation, codenamed Operation Uranus, aimed not just to relieve Stalingrad but to encircle the entire German Sixth Army. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counterattack began. Thousands of Soviet tanks and troops surged forward from the north and south of Stalingrad, crashing into the weaker Romanian and Hungarian divisions that guarded the flanks of the German Sixth Army. The Germans, caught off guard by the scale and speed of the assault, were quickly overwhelmed. Within days, the Soviet forces had encircled Stalingrad, trapping over 300,000 Axis soldiers inside the city. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, realized the gravity of the situation but was confident that Hitler would authorize a retreat. Instead, orders from Berlin were clear: hold your positions. There will be no retreat. The situation inside the encirclement quickly became dire. The German soldiers, lacking winter clothing and adequate rations, huddled in their makeshift shelters, enduring freezing temperatures and constant Soviet artillery bombardment. The Luftwaffe attempted to airlift supplies to the trapped soldiers, but the effort was woefully inadequate. Hunger and disease spread like wildfire through the ranks. Desperation set in. German soldiers, once proud and confident, now scavenged for food in the ruins. Some resorted to eating their horses, others raided supply depots, and the morale of the once mighty army began to crumble. The Soviet forces tightened the noose, pushing the Germans into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. The Volga River, a once impossible barrier, was now under Soviet control, and supplies flowed freely to the Red Army. In the heart of the city, General Chukov and his men continued their brutal fight, forcing the Germans to fight for every inch of territory they still held. The Germans, outnumbered and outgunned, fought back with whatever they had left, but it was clear that the battle was turning in favor of the Soviets. By January 1943, the once proud 6th Army was a shadow of its former self. Starving, freezing, and suffering from constant Soviet attacks, the soldiers could no longer fight effectively. General Paulus, trapped in his headquarters in Stalingrad, received a fateful message from Hitler: victory or death. Surrender is forbidden. But the situation was untenable. The Soviets launched their final assault in mid-January, smashing through the last German defenses. Soviet tanks and infantry stormed the remaining pockets of resistance, while the German soldiers, many of them sick and frostbitten, could barely lift their rifles to defend themselves. On January 31, 1943, Paulus, defying Hitler's direct orders, surrendered to the Soviets. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured alive, and the once vaunted Wehrmacht had suffered a catastrophic defeat. The remaining German soldiers followed suit, surrendering en masse, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. The streets of Stalingrad, littered with debris, shattered buildings, and the bodies of fallen soldiers, bore witness to the unimaginable horror of the battle. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians had been killed, wounded, or captured during the 6-month siege. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was a symbol of defiance, a triumph that marked the turning point in the war. No longer were they on the defensive. From this moment on, the Red Army would push the Germans westward, toward eventual defeat in Berlin. The Germans, once unstoppable, had suffered a blow from which they would never fully recover. Stalingrad broke the myth of Nazi invincibility, and the tide of World War II had irrevocably shifted. As the surviving Soviet soldiers stood among the ruins of their city, there was no celebration. The cost of victory had been immense, and the devastation around them was a stark reminder of the horrors of war. But there was also a deep, quiet pride. They had defended their homeland against an invader who had vowed to destroy them. They had held their ground, and in doing so, they had changed the course of history. Stalingrad, once a symbol of death and destruction, would forever be remembered as the city where the tide of World War II turned.